So, Pete, thank you so much for coming on. I know we had a hard time getting the schedule, but I appreciate your patience and dealing with me with that.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
How you doing today?
I'm good. I have my dogs in here with me. It's baking in this room. I've been working in here all day. I've got the heating on full blast because it's freezing here in Scotland, and we're getting the house renovated. So we're basically cramming all of the animals in the living space into my office. So if we get disturbed, you'll know why.
I love dogs. Um, awesome, man. Well, yeah, I just want to get started talking about some. What's funny is like because I've my own my most familiar point of contact with you was actually in the from the ground up course. That's like
Right.
a course I often recommend to people who are just getting started in poker. So congrats on that.
Thank
I
you.
think it was a great course for beginning poker players. But I've never really heard an answer to this. How did you get started in poker? Like, what's
Mm.
your story of how you got started?
So it goes back a while. I'm an absolute dinosaur, and I'm going to show my age here. But if we go back to like, let's say 2009, 2010 for a minute here, there was a place called flopturnriver.com. And not many people know this, but Ben Sulsky, Sauce123, used
Yeah.
to hang out there. And so did like lots of other good players, not just for the era, but even people that went on to become quite prolific after that. And I would post hands in forums. And this is the only, obviously, I have like a boring origin story of playing some stupid home game when I was 16, but I won't bore you with that. But in terms of actually like making money at online poker for the first time, it was really around that era, and it was grinding, starting at 25 and L, 50, 100, 200, 400 as it was back in the day, a little bit 600, these kind of games, and really having this free well of forum experience from actual experts posting for free on hand. So, like, if you want to say, how did I develop my skills? Initially, it was very much like Flop Turn River and that community that I would say where I have to thank for that. Not so much 2+2. It's an area of the internet, the poker internet, I've always somehow avoided or just wanted to avoid. I'm not really sure exactly why that is. But yeah, that place was great. And then from there, just grinding up a bankroll, playing like six max reg tables, table selecting, and having peers, like having people I talk to in, I don't know if you remember, what was it called? IRC, like a kind of chat client that people used back in the day. We had a subgroup in there, kind of similar to like a kind of old school version of Discord or Slack or something
Yeah,
like that.
gotcha. Okay.
And we used to hang out in there, and there were like tiers of that. There was like an elite club that only good players could get into, and it was, I guess, it was really having that community that was to thank for me being able to build a skill set and actually become successful at the game. From there, I decided I didn't like playing poker full time. Ultimately, started the coaching business, and I've done that for, yeah, the best part of full time for the last five years or so. But even like part time before that, I started to transition away from playing around
Nice.
that time, and moved into coaching a bit more. But yeah, it was ultimately that place, that forum that started it
Nice.
all for me.
Yeah, I wanna get into like what caused you to transition to coaching because I'm in a similar transition myself. But I'm curious, like, what made you think that, like, before, right, you were, like, playing casually in home games, etc. Like, at that time, what made you think, like, no, I should put in the time to grind and do this seriously, and like, I can make money at this?
Basically, raw passion,
Mm.
infatuation,
Yeah,
fascination for the game.
yeah,
I remember being in a pub with a friend one night, and we loved poker. Me and my friend Doug, I still talk to him today, but now we talk about other games. And I remember we'd play heads up, then we'd like go for a drink afterwards. And I remember like one night being in the bar after one of our heads up matches, and I'm kind of saying to him like, these are like £5, £10 SNGs we're playing against each other, right? We're playing like 20 NL online at this point. We're not really poker players yet.
yeah,
And I'm saying to him, I'm like, man, do you know what? I think I might be the best poker player in the world. He's like, shut up, Pete. You're drunk. Like, be quiet. I'm like, no, seriously, I think I might like be the best at poker ever. Like, I might become the best in the world. And it was this like child, like, I'm
yeah,
22 years old, 21 years old, this like kid like dream ambition
yeah,
that I don't want to have a job. Have never been comfortable working for other people. It's probably why I went into having my own business in later life, but I've never been comfortable working a grind that I don't enjoy. And freedom is one of my higher tier values, not just
yeah.
freedom of speech, but freedom of behavior as well, and freedom of life. And that is the thing that's driven me throughout my career. I would never even be able to fathom working for another person these days. And even then, when it wasn't apparent that poker would even work, I just wanted it to work so badly that it was almost like there was no other option. It was like tunnel vision.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's a lot of common traits among people who are just like, yeah, that just like, it's kind of weird because, yeah, people have asked me too how I got into poker. And it's like, it's kind of a hard point to pinpoint, you know? It was just like, it was kind of casual. And then at some point it was like, no, I want to be one of the best at this, right? Just like you just hit
Mm-hmm.
this point where, and it's hard to pinpoint when that happened, but like suddenly it was something I was obsessed with. And yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How did you find the transition to coach life? Like did you miss the game? Do you still miss playing more, or are you just is it just good, like you're just happy you don't play as much?
Yeah, I am overall happy that I don't play as much. I found mental game of grinding mass volume really, really tough. I think everybody does.
Yeah.
But I remember just like going on the kind of swings, like when the Zoom games first came to town in like 2014, 2015, and I was playing a lot of Zoom. It was way more volatile than the table selection at reg tables that I'd been doing. I always recommend to students table select at reg tables. Don't force yourself to play Zoom
Yeah.
just because it's like comforting and it's convenient and it's nice. Like, don't choose experience here because like
Yeah.
long term profitability is way more important.
Yeah.
And I started playing a lot of Zoom, and I went into a bit of a rabbit hole at the time as well of just hating poker, like hating the experience of grinding,
Mm.
like kind of. And I was doing some coaching on the side, and the coaching was really lovely. It was like a lovely refuge from like
Yeah.
the turbulence of and the isolation of grinding, because at this point my community had broken down, people had gone off in different directions. I didn't have a proper community to replace it yet of like-minded players. I was kind of
Yeah.
on my own suddenly. The players around me were all weaker rather than stronger, and that can
Mm.
be a really lonely place to be strategically and socially as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a combination of those things. But the more I coached and the more I created content, the more I felt like a real person, the more I felt like, okay, I'm a functional part of the world. I'm giving something back, but I'm
Yeah.
interacting with humans and it's ticking different boxes within my brain and, fueling different normal, natural reward circuits within my head. And that made me feel human again. And I was able to enjoy playing again because it was now part time, and I was able to like play much better than I had when I was forced into the full time grind and my back was up against the wall. Um, do I still miss playing? Yes. This morning, I was just thinking as I was having lunch, it just came off of a session where I didn't play particularly well on stream and was kind of distracted by chat and other things. You probably know how it is when you
Yeah.
can't fully focus on your game when you're streaming. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I could fully focus? Wouldn't it be nice if that A game that I achieve, like occasionally on stream or occasionally on a YouTube video while I'm producing content,
Yeah.
wouldn't it be cool if I could achieve that regularly? If I was match sharp again, if I was fit?
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking, well, one, the online poker climate isn't what it used to be. It's ridiculously hostile these days to someone
Yeah.
trying to make a living that way. It's not impossible, it's hostile. And then two, no, I would quickly go insane if I stopped putting all the time into my business. My business has been far more successful than I could have been at the tables in that time. It's been more lucrative, and that's not a brag. It's just a simple fact. If I went back to playing full time again, there's a sobering realization there that I wouldn't make as much money, even
Yeah.
if I did really well. And I love what I'm doing right now. I love building the brand. I'm actually like I fell in love with the business side of
Yeah.
poker. I really love it. And as much as I want to like be that geek again, be that kid that's chasing the dream again and dive into the strategy and study 6 hours a day and grind another six, it's not compatible with my life anymore and who I am. And I know it wouldn't work long term. But yeah, I still get the itch. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, business is also rewarding in kind of a tangential sense. Like to it's still strategy. Like you still have to strategize, right? Like it's still a lot of, yeah, I feel very similar in the sense of when you were saying the you feel more like a person, like you're contributing to the world. Like, because I get this
Mm-hmm.
all the time from people about like, why do I coach? I'm sure you do too. But like if you're, if you're a good enough player to play, why do you coach? And like, one, I still play significantly, probably more than you do, I imagine. But
For sure.
but two, the thing is like I really, yeah, there's like something deeply rewarding about working with somebody and working with people, and like, and it's like you really lose that like when you're in a zero sum contest as your main source of income all the time, right? Like it's pretty eroding of things that I really value about myself in life, and like you really feel like you're losing contact to some of those parts of yourself. And Whereas now when I'm working with somebody, yeah, it's like, no, we're out of this zero sum game. We're collaborating. We're trying to like build something together.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's really great. Um, so did you initially start Carrot Poker School, or when you started coaching, when did you do the Run It Once course? When did you make that in your like
Um, must have been about 2018 that I recorded the
okay.
course on Run It Once, which is more just for like total beginners, I would say, to online
Yeah,
play,
yeah.
like not anyone that's at all intermediate. Um, but before that, I'd made a living from part-time playing and part-time private tuition for the last few years before that, and that was
Okay.
slowly becoming more and more towards the book. You know, the Grinder's Manual was my first book, which is I don't even sell it on my store anymore. I don't consider it representative to what I understand
Mm,
of the game now at all, so I don't sell it anymore. But the book was a big thing at the time. Private coaching was a big thing from the ground up, and working with Run It Once in general was a really positive experience. You know, it gave me a platform. I was able to reach far more potential clients that way and do loads of one-to-ones. And working with Run It Once was the thing that really gave me enough coaching hours to just coach full time and never have to play. So I did start moving into that. Then Carrot Corner had always existed. It used to be a site where I would write my poetry and record a melody on guitar and put it on there and also advertise coaching. It was extremely just like a personal blog
yeah,
website
yeah.
that I also used to sell coaching. But then, you know, eventually it moved away from that. It became more professional. I met
Yeah.
my assistant and editor, who at the time was like this 18-year-old kid that was like, Pete, this is a mess. Like, look at the state of your business and your websites. This 18-year-old Brazilian girl's telling me that my site is like horrendous and I'm a boomer and everything is horrible and it could be lovely, and you know, sort of implying that maybe I have some potential to succeed in business if I could sort this out. So from 2019 onwards, 2020, COVID, that sort of time, we started really getting serious about Carrot Corner being a site that looked good, that sold courses, that
Mm,
taught poker the right way, you know, made it more of an academic subject. And we really became not a big part of the market because we're still not, but we catered to a niche of the student that really wants to study poker as if it was in a university and was being taught by experts rather than just digest the big tome of secrets or, you
yeah,
know, pick up free content on YouTube and copy the sort of pseudo half-baked logic of the commentator there. So
sure.
that's what we started doing, was trying to fill that niche in that part of
Gotcha.
the market.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. I haven't dove enough into like your content to yet be aware, but that is a good point of recognizing, I think, a hole in the market of poker training content is there's not enough, yeah, like A to Z structured learning, of poker. There's very like even Run It Once, which I love, but still it's still very fragmented. It's like
Mm-hmm.
here's a video on this, here's a video on this, here's a video on this. The courses are a little bit more thorough, but if you're like a Run It Once subscriber, you're picking up like whatever single videos. And there's also like a selection effect here where it's like I'm going to look at the things that I want to learn, which means the things that I probably need to learn are probably not being are being avoided, right?
Yeah.
um yeah. That's something that made me think of something, but I've lost it now. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, so it's interesting. So I'm curious about your sort of like progression through poker and like your views, because the way I viewed you for a
Mm-hmm.
while was this sort of like theoretical purist. Was like that's I don't know if that was accurate or if I just like mistook you. And when I say theoretical, the game is bounded by theory, right? So like you can't get outside of that.
Mm-hmm.
But like I guess more of like a GTO purist, like that was the space you occupied in my mind
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason. And then it wasn't until fairly recently that I've started been seeing some more of the tweets and stuff you've been putting out that I've come to realize this seems to be not how you really think about the game at
Mm-hmm.
all.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm kind of curious, is that accurate? Like, were you at some point a very GTO pure? It's knowing the era in which you came up in poker, I find it hard to believe that you were ever a GTO purist. Now, as I'm like
Mm-hmm.
putting the pieces together, because
Mm-hmm.
I think there were very few GTO purists who started in that era. I think most of them started in the era of like when Pile Solver was already around, if that makes sense. I've spoken with
Yep.
Kevin Rabichow about this on the podcast as well. It's like the different things that like different eras are kind of known for. But yeah, I'm curious, was that ever you? And if it was, when did that shift happen? Why did it happen? Like how do you view how do you strategically think about the game today?
Man, this is a huge wormhole we've just opened up
Yeah.
here. I'd love to talk about this. Actually, it's a good question. So initially in the early days, obviously there was no GTO, there were no solvers. Maybe
Yeah.
there was a GTO, but we didn't have any access to it. And we did figure out some theoretical concepts. There were concepts in the objective realm, but there weren't as many of them as I teach today in terms of poker theory. I would say that in about 2016, 2017, my game, a very bad thing happened to me that ultimately ended up being a good thing, but it was a very dark time in terms of my poker game. Not in terms of my life, that was
Yeah.
okay, but in terms
Yeah.
of my poker game, it was a kind of dark age that came over, you know. I'm very dramatic. Sorry, I've
Yeah.
been
No,
recording
I
too
love
many
it. I love
podcasts
it.
where my co-host and I
A,
are very dramatic about everything.
yeah, a shadow moved
Um,
over your poker game. I get it.
it did. It was like the specter of basically religious GTO adherence moved over my game and
Yeah.
everything
Okay.
became dark. And I was being guided by false gods. I was being guided by, may as well just go full blown with this analogy now.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was being
Just
guided
extend it.
by these pio dogma that were so strong and binding, and I was even becoming a frequency slave, a slave to
Mm.
frequencies. And that is the one thing I stand against the most right now is putting frequency before EV. I think it's one of the cardinal sins of poker. I think you'd probably agree it sinks the careers of aspiring poker players when they don't understand EV but do try to achieve certain frequencies in their game. I
Absolutely.
think
Yeah.
that's quite lethal.
Yeah.
And I went through a phase where all of the skills I'd built in the flop turn river days back from 2010 to 2014 started to be put on the shelf. I shelved them. I put them away in the cupboard and I replaced
Mm.
them with a completely GTO approach. I became obsessive about having the right sizing, imitating the solver,
Yeah.
stuff like that. There was a time in my life where I wouldn't even say I'm a GTO purist because I think there are good poker players who are GTO purists. They will
Sure.
still deviate sometimes, but they have a very GTO foundation and they don't like to deviate aggressively. They like to be quite reserved with that. And I think that's what it means to be a GTO purist is that you try to play GTO
Yeah.
or your best representation of it in most situations, right? And I
Yeah.
wasn't even that. I didn't understand GTO.
Mm.
I wrote a book called 100 Hands, which I'm not even a fan of now because it was some kind of attempt from an unready version of me to try to like talk about range versus range play. And
Mm.
I don't actually think range versus range play is much of a thing. I think that range
Mm.
versus range sets a context of the EV favorability of the world, the polarization, relative polarization of the world, the symmetry or asymmetry, lots of different concepts that you do need to understand. And
Mm.
that's what I do in Carrot Poker School. I explain all of that. But back then, I went into this hole where I didn't understand theory. I didn't know the laws of physics, but I was obsessed with GTO. And when you don't understand fully why the solver outputs are what they are and exactly how and why the game is behaving in the way it does objectively, you can't imitate.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that I tell people today, I'm so big today, as you've seen me tweet things about how bad it is to just routinely copy solvers and not think through the EV of spots. The reason I take such a hardball stance on that these days is that it happened to me. And it didn't just happen to me, it happened to the unfortunate students that I taught at that time. And
Yeah.
I actually guided them in the wrong way.
Yeah.
And I'm really sorry about that to them.
Yeah.
Like I guided them in the wrong way because I went into a dark age because I had to get worse before I could get better. Because
Yeah.
this was such a huge shift in how we had to learn the game that by the time I came out of it again, I was beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I was beginning to see the sunlight at the top of the forest. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm actually really good at like thinking through what people's ranges are and hand reading because I came up in an era like you alluded to where I
Yeah.
had to do that to get by. That was the only way of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I took all of those skills that I'd honed and I got them back out the cupboard and I was like, okay, well, how do I integrate these with the GTO and how do I get really good at GTO? And as I started to learn exactly why and how the laws of objective poker physics functioned, and as I began to be able to know the solver intimately, like it was my friend, like it was
Yeah.
my wife or something, I was like, oh, Pio, hey, how you doing today? I know what you're going to say about this spot now, and I know why.
Yeah.
And when it was 2020 and I came back out of that fully, and I was like, wow, my game is stronger than it's ever been. Not
Yeah.
at the tables, because clicking buttons in 10 seconds, that's rusty as hell. That's not what I mean.
Yeah.
I'm very rusty in that respect.
Yeah.
But in terms of understanding the game, it, it was a sudden like blossoming of putting everything together to the point
Yeah.
where I was like, right, I'm now ready to put all of this down somewhere. And that's when I made the Carrot Poker School, which is my attempt to like create a theoretical Bible of the game of No Limit Hold'em and how it works objectively. And then once I'd done that, I was like, man, that was exhausting. That was a huge, like, birthing this huge thing that I've done now, this tome of theory. And then I was like, right, let's just work on exploits for a while. I made a thing called Grady. This is like the exploitative course that's coming out this summer, hopefully, and really got heavily into like not mass data on its own,
Yeah.
but how mass data relates to all the stuff I already kind of understood from the old days about how people think about the game, human
Yeah.
deficiencies, and the people I'd coached as well. You probably know this, that when you teach people, you learn the normal human deficiencies in loads of spots just by working with students that have
Yeah.
those deficiencies, right?
Yep.
So nowadays, what you're probably seeing is someone who has both sides and is very big on both sides. Like I'm very big on theory still. I think if you don't know how the game works, I don't even think it makes sense to start exploiting left, right, and center. I
Yeah.
don't think blindly copying mass data is very good either.
Yeah.
But what you're seeing now is someone who is, I fought the GTO fight. I fought the fight already of let me try and bring my students into GTO. Let me try and get them a fundamental understanding. And now what I'm trying to do this year more than anything is reach the people who are to GTO and show them that there is this whole other frontier that's
Yeah.
always existed that they might not know about. And that this concept true EV that I came up with is the idea that there is a true EV to every line in practice against your opponent or against your pool or whatever
Yeah.
sort of specificity of opponent you can use there. And that's what matters. And the really beautiful thing about it is that that actually depends both on theory and on, you know, hand reading and human
Yeah. Yeah.
understanding and exploits. So you're kind of seeing the finished product right now, but I'm in a phase of pushing people more towards exploits because I think it's now the epidemic used to be that people didn't have enough theory. And now I think there's a breed of player that has a lot of good theory, but doesn't have any hand reading ability. So that's why I'm kind of trying to fight that fight now on Twitter and
Mm.
stuff like that.
Yeah, I think this is a very common sort of path for a lot of poker players. Like I see this a lot. I mean, I went through something very similar, and I think a lot of people do. There's something very seductive about feeling like you can just have an answer, right? Like I think this is the seduction of a solver, and like especially now as you get all these browser-based tools to where like solutions and quote unquote answers are just so readily accessible. There's just something so seductive about knowing what's right, like having the confidence, even if that confidence is just false, if it's just like this doesn't actually reflect anything accurate. Like I can make a grid and color some squares in there for you, but there's just like there's something so yeah, it's just alluring about the idea that like I can, after this session, I can run all my hands through GTO Wizard and get some score that's really high, and it's like almost like an emotional coping mechanism for like if my session went poor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so, and I mean I think yeah, I think we all go through that, and then I think it kind of gets it kind of takes getting beat up by like your lack of, I think one, the lack of fulfillment you feel because you feel so beholden to something, like you feel so chained into having to do something that it makes playing exhausting. Like it makes playing not fun. Like you just
Yep.
feel stressed. You're double checking yourself and all the time, and like you just never really. And then like you were saying, when you don't really understand, especially if you have like a weaker understanding of the theory itself, it can all just seem random. Like it's so stressful to like look up at different spots, and like if you don't have enough of a base of what's actually happening there, yeah, it can all seem random. And you can also like the propensity for people just to hone in on all the wrong things, like some random hand that gets played differently, and it's just like, look, this is just like some outlier that's being moved, like the needle that's moving this EV is something so precise in this solver, it's just not worth you worrying about. But yeah, I think a lot of people go through that and then end up on the other side beneficially, like you said. Like it's good because when you really dive into that, you come out with a lot of relevant theoretical knowledge. You know, you come out with
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, this is how the game works. Now let me map this knowledge on to the world as I see it, like the actual, you know, games, hands being played and the way people are playing it. And I think that's the highest EV way to play. It's just like apply theory to people, the actual situations you're in.
Yeah. And I would say that
So
this whole, oh, quick interjection would just be to say
yeah,
that
yeah,
some people actually frame it as if you have to choose, right? Like,
yeah, yeah,
is it
yeah.
GTO? Is it exploitative? Is one awful? Are they mutually exclusive? And that to me is the most absurd thing ever.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree. That was like the even fairly early on, this was like the dichotomy or like the false dichotomy that like I never really got was like this like yeah, this like theory versus exploit. And it's from it's only it kind of mirrors political discussions in the sense that like people are taking extreme versions of something that is just like this isn't black and white. And so you have like the Charlie Carells out there who are convincing people that you have a choice between playing like this or playing like this, you know what I mean? Or Charlie Carroll, however you say his last name. Or and I'm trying to think of like a I don't know. The you know what's funny is like the good players who are theoretical purists are kind of going away, like who are like GTO purists. There aren't as many that I can recall off the top of my head. I think most of the great players are in the mid ground. Like they understand this. I guess you have Linus. Maybe there's
Mm-hmm.
Linus out there who's probably just like a I'm never deviating from the theory that I know. But um yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, but it is kind of this weird false dichotomy where it's like, no, it's like the game is bound by theory, but just like, but people aren't playing like solvers. So like, what do you do now? You know, it's just, yeah. So this goes back to, so I read a tweet of yours that I want to get more of like see if you could unpack it for me. I think it said something about how like, you should just be playing your hand. Like range v range is not relevant. Like play your hand or something like that, or
Mm-hmm.
just like yeah, play hand play. What I'm assuming there's some nuance in here because on its face, if someone just showed me this idea and was like, "Do you agree or disagree with this?" I'd be like, "Well, I think it's." Let me just say what I how I take it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it doesn't make any sense to me. You can't play your hand without a concept of a range. Is how this strikes me. Like
Mm-hmm.
in order for me to understand what my hand has an incentive to do, I need to understand. Okay, so like if I have king 8 on ace king 2 in position button versus big blind, the knowledge that you don't have very many worse pairs for me to value bet against. That's a range fact. But
It's
also if
not
I put
your
in
range
a
though, is it? That's
what's that?
their range. That's
Yeah,
their range though, not your range.
sure. But like what awareness of your range like I guess their perception of your range is extremely relevant, right? Like if you believe I'm going to be value, if they believe I'm going to be, let's just take a river spot where people believe I'm going to be bluffing too much, then my the result, my range should shift in value betting thinner. Right now,
Mm-hmm.
that will make a decision. Of course, I only have a hand in a spot. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So like I'm only ever playing this hand, but it should have a resulting impact on my range as a whole. So I'll just give that to you to
Okay.
unpack. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So maybe we can start with one premise and you can tell me if you agree or disagree with this premise. Because if you
Okay.
disagree with this, then we might butt heads on everything.
Okay.
And if you agree with this, then I think we can make progress. Not to give you a big ultimatum, but let me
Oh,
go
I'm
for it.
in.
So the EV of your decision in a vacuum, in a
Okay.
hand that you're in, right? In any
Yeah.
one hand that you're in, depends on what your cards are, what your opponent's range is, and how they're playing their range.
Yeah, of
Now, it
course.
may also, some of that may depend on what they think of your range, but
Yeah.
that's more indirect. The direct, sufficient things here are your hand, your opponent's range, the texture, and how they're playing their range to different options on the game tree. So, can we start by agreeing that
Yes.
that's true?
So far, I hear nothing I disagree with.
Good.
Yes.
So, what I mean by that tweet is that for most students, what I see happening that's somewhat of an epidemic is that people are making decisions based on hands they don't currently have
Mm.
and not engaging at all or engaging very poorly with what their hand is and what their opponent's range is and what the EV of different decisions would be based on that. So let me give you an example. It's not uncommon at all for me to hear students say something like, I bet the turn because this is a good card for my range. Okay.
Mm.
And I'll say, okay, well, what's your hand here? And they'll say, well, I have nines. The flop was king, jack, 4-3, button versus big blind. So jack 4-3, let's say you have nines, you see bet the flop, the turn comes a king, and they pot the turn. When check two, they double barrel pot the turn. And I'll say, so why did you do that? They'll say, because I thought I had a range advantage. The king is better for me. It's really good for my range. I have all of the ace king. I have all of the aces. I have all of the sets. He would have folded a lot of his king X on the flop, which at least that's good. That's at least some hand reading. So I'll say, but what if I told you the EV of check is higher than the EV of bet with this hand? Would that be a problem for your logic? They'd say, yeah, I suppose that would be a problem for my logic. Had they understood EV of their hand against their opponent's range there, they'd be able to say, okay, I have nines. When I bet, I lose a lot of extra money against Jack X plus, right? Which usually doesn't fold the spot.
Okay. Yeah.
And when I check, I don't lose that money.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, there are some slight downsides to checking. My opponent realizes, hits a low set sometimes, rivers two pair that they would have folded on the turn, rivers a straight, they would have folded on the turn. Stuff like that can happen. That's the downside. Meanwhile, if I check, I may end up losing the pot because some river bet happens on some card and I fold the best hand. That's another downside of checking. But all of these things are part of the game tree and they're all to do with hand against range. Hand against range. Range is important, but I think there needs to be more emphasis on the range of the opponent and how it's playing. And yes, I agree. Some of that may come down to what your range is. And one thing I'll say is very important is understanding the landscape. But the landscape is not playing your range. The landscape is knowing what your range is and using that to determine what's going on hand versus range. So in this example, where the flop is Jack 5-3 and we see bet and they call and the turn is a king, understanding that you have a big range advantage here, that the EV, I call this a favorable world in the Carrot Poker School, pot share EV for you, for your range, probably like 59% of the pot there, their range 41. That would be my guess. Something like that. Therefore, all air combos are at least as good to bet as they are to check. Sure. So I can bet any air combo in this spot without EV loss in theory.
Sure.
And I know that because I understand the favorability of the world.
Okay.
But I think world favorability or world, sort of landscape awareness is a much better way to frame that initial step than to say I'm playing my range. Because to say you're playing your range really confuses people. A lot of the time they end up making polarization errors, betting the middle of it.
Yeah.
Countless other things they do wrong as well. I agree that it's also bad if they have no awareness of their range at all and they don't know that their range is strong enough to give them way higher fold equity than the break-even point in some river, and then they miss a mandatory bluff because they don't understand that as well. So you do need to know roughly what your range looks like in some spots theoretically in order to derive the theoretical landscape and then know what's good with your hand against your opponent's range.
Yeah.
But the part that directly affects EV and is most closely bound to EV is the latter part of your hand against your opponent's range.
Okay.
And so I think for many students of a lower level, what they need to do is forget about range advantage and nut advantage and which sizing scheme is best in the solver and things like that and what they're going to do with their whole range and get back to solving the basic puzzle, which might be easy for you or I, for me or you, which is saying, their range is X, my equity is this, I have enough equity to value bet, let me bet this size because I have enough equity against their range to do that. Maybe we can do that because we've seen it in a solver a million times. We know what the equity is. But for the student that can't do that and then starts trying to play other combos in their range that they don't currently have, that's an issue. And I'll just tell you what this quote said roughly. It said, don't play hands you don't have, play the hand you do have against your opponent's range, right? And that's not to say that that's all you need to do, but it's to say that it's a much better roadmap than getting lost within intricacies of your range that have nothing to do with the EV of your action in the spot with your hand.
Sure.
So that's what I'd say.
Yeah, so I agree. I definitely see to the target audience of this message. So let me just first recognize that. Like I definitely see that there is an easy to misunderstand thing here if you are a weaker to mid-tier player making decisions based on things like this. Where I do feel like it's not technically factually accurate is that there are in any given spot, an infinite amount of potential strategies. So like, let's say we take that exact same turn situation. I can pick a bet size where nines is totally fine to bet, right? Like I can pick a bet size where like betting that is better than checking. Like if I bet 10% of the pot with nines on the turn, that's probably a fine value bet. There's a problem with this strategically, and the strategic error that this comes down to what strategy is my range as a whole picking. Like I think that is where your range becomes very relevant. Like the reason we should pot the turn and therefore not bet nines, those are contingent facts, and those are only explainable within the context of my range, right? In my view, like you get what I'm saying? Like if we're limiting
Yeah.
ourselves to like two
Okay.
actions there, then yeah,
Okay.
like yeah, you definitely want to check when compared with potting. But like
Yep.
what I do see, for example, is big strategic errors by people
Hmm.
focusing too much on their hands, where it's like, oh, I can
Okay.
this hand can bet the size for value. And it's like, well, yeah, you can, but like, why are you picking that as a strategy here?
Sure. So I think the higher you get and like the more advanced you get, understanding, let's call it vacuum EV, the factors that make a play good or bad in a vacuum, the more you do want to pay attention to what I would call your toolkit. And again, sorry to always go on about my content. I'm not even doing
No,
this
no, no.
intentionally, but everything you're saying, I just know that you probably haven't watched the Carrot Poker School. So you
I
might not
haven't.
know
Yeah,
that in grade two, there are numerous videos about how to construct the toolkit for the turn.
mm,
A few different episodes are about this. So, for example, one of them will say, on these turns, I recommend the toolkit of overbet check. Now that we're in that toolkit, how do we choose our overbets from our checks? Where are our value thresholds, etc.? Why do we
sure,
want to choose that toolkit in the first place? Because we have a giant nut advantage. We're interested in increasing the pot towards the investment ceiling for the very nutted unique hands that we have the monopoly over in our own range, and all of these things. So, everything you're saying here, I do think it's important. When I make a tweet like that, it's very much aimed at the target audience who can't do
yeah,
any of that yet because they've not reached that point, but are trying to and are committing huge EV blunders in a vacuum by trying to. But I do agree with you that if you reopen the pot for 10% there with only nines, and there's a relatively high degree of visibility to that, which I think there actually is, contrary to normal
sure.
spots where there's a low visibility. I think there's quite a lot of visibility there
If I
if you start
10%
10%ing.
if I
Yeah,
10% the turn,
I think a lot of regs are going to attack that, and if your whole range is
I mean,
nines and you fold it all, then yeah.
but you could make this. I mean, there's just like so many arguments here that this is where you get down the rabbit hole though. It's like you could be like,
Mm,
okay, well, let me just 10% range, and then like like why is that strategically wrong? And it's like that's probably like if I give a solver, well, we can use ruse because ruse could
mm,
like could like node lock instantly for this. Like you can just
mm,
change 10% on the turn. I bet like it just 10% range on the turn there. It just like bets 10% with everything.
mm,
And like that will probably be within the context of that strategy, that will be
mm,
fine. But it just
mm,
will be suboptimal compared to a different entire range strategy. Like
mm,
you will just be making less money. And so even without the visibility problems, right? Because like if they're gonna
mm.
attack you like they should, then like your good hands make a lot of money by getting raised, like you whatever.
Right, right.
But the only real way to understand like what is the best strategic option in terms of all the strategic options available to, because I guess
Mm-hmm.
what my concern is with students is I could see like accidental infinite range splitting where you're
Yep.
like you're playing your hand and you're like, okay, well, what does my hand want to do? Well, my hand doesn't mind block, but it's like, but
Mm-hmm.
like, but you're just like not going to block here that often, like that would be. But all that to say, the target
Yep.
audience, I do believe that is a good message for. Just like
Mm.
you're and I do believe there's a progression of knowledge, right? Where it's like understand your EV of your like, yeah, the incentives on your hand, and that's how you get to good range construction is like
Yep.
understanding the incentives of each hand individually.
Agreed. Yeah, I
Um,
think I agree with like pretty much all of that. The only thing I would add is when you 10% pot with nines, in reality, it's actually very bad. If you build a 10% range bet strategy on the turn, right, and you're
sure.
also doing it with ace king and king jack in a set, the amount of exploitative EV you burn by not being raised
Yeah.
at the frequency you're meant to be raised at is catastrophic against
Yeah. Yeah.
humans. So if you don't know anything about hand versus range EV, like if you don't understand where the EV comes from
Sure.
for overbetting the turn or what's going on there in theory, if you've not
Yeah.
done a theory course and you've not talked to like good theoretical players about that, then you might actually not get that. You might end up oversimplifying and playing your range and saying, I have a big range advantage. When I have a big range advantage, I want to bet my range small and frequently. So I'm going to bet small and frequently. Then you do that with ace king. And then you've burned a ton of EV
Yeah.
because, and even more than you'll burn some theoretically because it's better to use an overbet there theoretically than it is to use 10% pot.
Totally. Yeah.
But you'll burn even more in exploitative reality because you're not going to get raised at the right frequency.
Yeah.
So I think there are dangers on both sides. There are definite dangers of playing your range without understanding where EV comes from in a vacuum context. I think that's
Yeah.
a huge problem, and that's what my tweet was aimed at.
Yeah.
I also agree with you that when you're blindly constructing, a toolkit, like out of just at a micro level of what every individual hand wants to do, then you are building a potentially very exploitable strategy.
Yeah.
And also, but that's not to say you're definitely losing EV. So if you ask me which is worse, I would
Yeah.
say playing every hand the way it can play in theory in a vacuum is very unlikely to cost you anything like the EV that playing your range with a bad concept of how to do that is going to cost you. And that's
Yeah.
why I aimed that tweet
Yeah.
at those people. Now, obviously, the optimal thing here for us to do is get students to understand range construction, understand theoretically what landscapes look like, and those are functions of range versus range. So, what I would call a poker environment or landscape, like who's the turn better for, who has more EV, who's in
Yeah.
position, who's out of position, what's configuration. These are all part of the landscape, and range versus range has a big say in that.
Yeah.
But we need to understand, when do we stop toolkit building? When do we stop strategy construction? And at what point do we move into, what does my hand want to do? Because what actually separates really successful students from less successful ones, in my opinion, is that ability to transition into that hand versus range thought process, wherein they're then able to say, I'm going to bet this hand bigger because this particular hand or type of hand gains more against villain's real strategy in true EV terms than the theoretical toolkit plan that I had built previously. But
Yeah.
I'm not at all trying to push this towards a let's think about every spot totally in a vacuum and never
Yeah.
build an awareness of range versus range environments. Not at all.
Yeah. I definitely agree with, especially your point of like, if you're going to do one, or if you're going to get one thing wrong, just playing your hand in a plus EV way is better than like trying to play your hand in a way that you think your range might, but that makes no sense for this hand. Like that is a way
Yeah.
worse error. Almost obviously, right? Like playing
Mm-hmm.
your hand in a minus EV way is a bigger error than not playing your hand in a minus EV way.
And a lot of people don't actually understand how EV functions at all, or they have a very limited understanding of it, but they've taken in the solver era, maybe they've worked with, like, they just fell in with the wrong crowd. You know, you fall in with like the smokers in high school and now you do drugs, you didn't go to university. Well, maybe you fall in with like the GTO solver obsessed crowd. And I actually taught a guy that plays 2NL and is doing everything, was, now we've fixed him and he's going to be moving out of 2NL, but was basically doing everything based on solver study and what his range wants to do. And he was so obsessed with texture because in his little study group, what they would do is they would get a hand and they would say, who's the board better for? And that would be like the be all and end all of the thought process. Then they would look at like aggregate reports in the solver and get really good at knowing like who's that card better for, but wouldn't actually understand where EV comes from at all, or understand the fact that at 5 and L, when a fish calls your turn check raise, your fold equity on the river is very, very low compared to that of equilibrium. Like they didn't understand something like that.
Yeah.
That when the fish goes through that filtering, they won't be folding at those stakes very often. Or when someone checks twice, they're overfolding. They miss like things like this. So I would say that there are a breed of players who fell in with like the sort of GTO nerd community, and not even the good ones, not even like the heroic purists that are like winning or winning big, like Linus or something, but actually just amateur GTO solver users that are leading them astray. And I think it is a problem, and it does actually set people on the wrong path. It's not that it's a lack of progress, it's actually anti-progress. It's progress in the opposite direction. They're being led north when they need to go south. And then that's even more work for someone like you or me to do, to like haul them back to where they need to get. So that sort of tweet, it comes from a place of frustration. It comes from like a deep place of like being sickened to the core of this type of thinking having infiltrated like some kind of disease into the community.
Yeah. No, I mean, I suspected as much, honestly. I mean, I'm used to being in the opposite shoes, where I say something that sounds very extreme, but like it's targeted to a specific group of people who I know are like just missing something fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. I recently wrote a blog post talking about just the different generations of poker and the different problems they faced. And my point was that the problem today is people just don't know where the money comes from. Like there's just too much information out there. And I point to the last generation, and I was like, the last generation's problem was they didn't know how to get them. Like they didn't have enough information. Like they were figuring too many things out. But basically the point that I make is one of the reasons I think most of that generation of players are still some of the strongest players today is because they were hyper focused on where the money comes from. Like they were just hype, you know, it's just like where to, like you were saying, like your old school tool chest that you like put in the closet, when you pulled it back out, it was like, oh, this is all the stuff that matters. You know, this is, and
Yep.
and yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. That's the biggest thing I talk to people about all the time. It's just like you're throwing all these things around, like you're on the river facing a bet, and you're throwing around all these theoretical concepts, but like just where does the money come from in this spot? It comes from their bluffs. Are there enough of them?
Yep.
No, you just fold. Like move on with your life. Like yes, you
Yep.
just call. You just it's not um blockers be damned.
Absolutely. I
Uh
was just about to say, I think the biggest like symptom that when you had the bubonic plague, it was quite obvious because you had those big boil things bursting all over your skin. So it was like pretty obvious that you've got the bubonic plague, and that would be the hallmark. There are probably other symptoms, but no one talked about them. It wasn't like, oh, you've got the fever. That was probably part of it. I'd imagine it was. But
yeah.
anyway, back to poker. If someone is obsessed with blockers, if someone is like basically saying, I was like, why did you call the river? And let's say the spot is like chronically underbluffed, right? By the sub pool or pool they're against. So why did you call the river? And they say, well, I unblock some bluffs with this card or something like that. I know we know that swings things by maybe 1% equity,
Yeah.
1% win rate, 2%. We've
Yeah.
actually done some studies that show that the impact of blockers is usually between 0 and 3% in almost all spots. Um, so then that to me, the blockers there, that's like having the boils. That's like you have the GTO plague. You
Yeah.
have it. You have the boils all over your face. So there's nothing else that can be, and you have the primary symptom of it.
Yeah.
So blockers to me have this saying that I repeat to people, and it's kind of cheesy and cliched and blunt and stupid, but it goes like this: if you're thinking about blockers, don't. That's the saying. Just don't.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few. It's tough because I generally think that's true. I do think there are some spots where like blockers are particularly good or bad, but
Yeah.
they're usually spots with like very clearly defined ranges, and the ranges are very tight.
Yeah.
And right, and so it's like you're looking at someone who's repping a flush, and 70% of their flush combos contain the ace of spades or something. Then and you have the ace of spades. Then it's like
Mm-hmm.
that's a sick blocker, right? That's not.
Yeah.
But other than that, and especially in wide range spots, like if you're blind be blind showing up on the river with like a 10 and you're like, or something, you know what I mean? And you're like, I shouldn't have a 10. Or I love that I have a 10. That's even the worst.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I blocked the, it's like, it doesn't matter. Like you're not like there. Yeah. Anyway, that point has
My
been.
favorite one is when they say, and they could have ace queen, but I block that. And I'm like, what do you mean you block that? It's like, well, I block it. It's like, what, entirely? They're like, well, I don't really know what combos are because I wasn't playing poker in 2012 when we counted them manually without
Yeah.
solvers. So no, I don't know. And I'll say, well, ace queen on the flop is 12 combos. There's an ace out there and there's no queen out there. So like villain's opening range in the hijack has 12 combos of ace queen now. It has 4 queens by 3 aces. They'll say,
Yeah.
okay. It's like, and now you have this queen. How many combos do they have now? Okay, so it's 9. So
Yeah.
you block 25% of the combos, but you express that as, but I block that, as if it's
Yeah.
no longer possible. It's a big problem.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's also just like in spots where people just like their value ranges are they're just far wider than like a single combo of hands. You know what I mean? So it's like your blocker is just it's not and with the other danger with blockers, which we're kind of getting down a rabbit hole though, is just like they're also chronically misunderstood in the sense that like in so many spots, like unblocking bluffs matters
Yeah.
so much more than blocking
Yeah.
value,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just anyway, yeah, we don't have to beat to death the blocker people, but uh
I think we do, but like we
yeah.
won't do that here.
Yeah, we won't do that here. Yeah, I mean it's brutal. Like I've been working a lot with Easty lately, who I know you've worked with.
Yep.
Um, and yeah, he has like a blocker contagion in spots where it's like it's and it is like a comfort blanket. It's just like this spot's uncomfortable. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know what to do, but I know this blocker means X, and
Mm-hmm.
so I'm just gonna make my decision based on this single data point that I
Yep.
have, and it's just gonna make me be able to defend to myself my decision, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Um, yeah,
It's like an insufficiency thing, right? There's this thing in grade 1 of the Carrot Poker School that's this guy called Adam, who I made up. And it's like Adam likes tomato soup and Adam likes roller coasters, right? This is what we know about Adam. Adam is at a theme park. Adam decides he's going to go on the roller coaster eating the bowl of tomato soup. And he reasons, I like soup and I like roller coasters, therefore I'm going to do it. So the decision making by Adam, and it's a picture of like a goofy kind of guy that you might see down the pub, like reading The Sun or something like that. Like you just picture him, right? This guy is just like a real bloke with a pint, like this kind of guy. And his thought process is very bad because it's so insufficient, right? And
Yeah,
that's what
yeah.
blockers are. It's like this thing that
Mhm.
does matter. Like it is relevant that you like tomato soup to that equation, and it is relevant you like roller coasters. If either of those things were false, you wouldn't even consider this proposition.
Sure.
But not considering the fact that the soup's going to go all over you and burn all the other people, that's really bad. And you might think this is a ridiculous example and it's
It's
funny and
so
whatever,
funny.
and perhaps it is, but poker players do this. One of my
Yeah.
favorite things to do in coaching is show people what the real life equivalent to their poker thought process looks like and be like, that's what you're doing,
Yeah.
because it
No,
shocks them
that's good.
sometimes.
That's awesome. That's hilarious. I thought you were gonna say what I wanted you to end that with. Like, you may think this is ridiculous, but I know a guy named Adam who took a bowl of tomato soup on a roller coaster.
I hope it's happened somewhere.
Yeah, I hope
Yeah.
so too. That reminds me of a friend of mine who like read a study that like caffeine was good for you before you run,
Mm-hmm.
and drank like 14 cups of coffee before the like one of his like a scheduled marathon he was doing. And he's just like, some is good, more is better. Like, I'm just, and it didn't go well.
I can imagine. Yeah, it
Um
sounds like Adam.
so this next one I'm curious about. This is actually what spawned a while ago me inviting you to do this podcast. I was watching you coach somebody, and this concept came up, and I'm curious again for you to unpack your views on this and for me to hear it, where basically someone said they placed a bet with a bluff because they thought it would make a person's range uncomfortable. Like, they thought they hated to face the bet with all these hands.
Mm.
And I remember this was sort of waived. It seemed to me that this was sort of waved off as like a relevant data point on whether or not you should bluff.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of like people are going to make the decisions for the reasons they have. Like, someone being uncomfortable doesn't mean they're folding too much.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember commenting, and I like my views on this are I kind of agree with this sentiment, but I do think people make decisions for emotional reasons far more than rational ones than they would like to admit in poker. And
Mm-hmm.
so like I
Mm-hmm.
think a fairly good indicator of people overfolding, especially regs in particular,
Mm-hmm.
is how uncomfortable are you? Like, how uncomfortable does this spot make the person? I don't think it's a straight line, but like if you were only using that as a metric for when to bluff and when not to, I think you would do okay.
Mm.
Um, generally speaking, what are your thoughts on that?
I think you would miss a lot of theoretically like mandatory bluffs, first of all, where like your range just lands with way more EV than your opponents, and then you have to like start reaching up into your showdown value and even rejecting check EV of 10 or 15% of the pot
Of
because
course.
the bet EV is just better. So with that aside, that
Yeah,
caveat
that
aside,
aside, yeah.
I mostly agree with this. I think that the problem again is one of immediacy or immediate causality. Now, when I say I'm going to bet X because you're going to be in a tough spot,
Yeah.
what I'm really saying is that it won't be easy for you to call with like lots of hands, and nor will it be like easy for you to fold with lots of hands. I think what people are saying there is that with a wide part of their opponent's range, the opponent is going to be kind of confused, suffering, torn, lost, something like that.
Sure.
And I do think that with the reg population, when that's the case, or even some of the recreational player population, there will be like a positive correlation in fold equity, as you say. But the way I would rather approach it is say, I would rather be a bit more clinical and say, this is an overfolded spot because the
Yeah.
target calling range, the range that has to actually mix call or pure call in game theory, is a bunch of combos that look bad to the human and don't look like they should be mixed calls or pure calls. And therefore, that those combos getting overfolded is enough to determine the whole range getting overfolded.
Yeah.
So I would rather be a bit more like clinical about it. But yes, I think you're right that if you taught someone, a mantra like if villain is likely going to be in a world of pain with lots of their range when you make a particular bluff, then the chances are it's a good bluff. I think that's like relatively solid. But it's important to understand that the suffering or the tornness isn't actually the goal. It's maybe just something that is correlated with the goal. The
Mm.
goal is to identify why and where people are overfolding based on the requirements that theory places on them, and
Yeah.
their based on the requirements that theory places on them and their unwillingness to actually meet those requirements. But yeah, you're not wrong that there's a
Yeah,
big correlation there.
I think I can add a little nuance to this too. I actually think
Mm,
spots that, because what you expressed was sort of like an uncomfortability towards both options.
mm,
I am actually speaking more of spots where like there are spots that are tangibly more uncomfortable to do one option over the other.
Right.
And I actually think this is a very good indicator of overcalled or overfold spots. Like if you just think like is calling more natural than
Yep.
folding,
Yep.
then it's just overcalled, right? Like you can just assume it's probably overcalled. Generally speaking, you can assume
Yep.
it's overcalled, and you could just not bluff that much there. And if folding is much more natural, like it's just because I mean, when you look at mass data, right, the spots that are being overfolded by regs are just spots where they just don't have that many strong holdings,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's just like they just overfold even when they should in theory. They're just overfolding because they don't have that many good hands, and not very good hands are very uncomfortable to call with, and so they
That's
just
it.
fold too much, and yeah. But okay, it seems we agree there. So this brings us to the real crux of where I think we're going to disagree, which this is solver versus 25 and L.
Let's go.
Yeah, so I'm curious because I think we have a ton of very little daylight between us on so many opinions.
Mm-hmm.
But I am still firmly in the camp that a solver would destroy 25 NL.
Okay.
Uh, I now caveat on this. This is not the same thing as me recommending people try to emulate a solver at 25 NL. Right? That's the enormous caveat I want to place on this. But what I find is often the case here, and this is one of the things that I think breaks this is akin to the kind of false dichotomy I see between exploitative and theoretical play, where I believe the best way to play is not like a solver. I still believe a solver would have a higher win rate than all of us in almost every game, like a true solver would. And the reason why I think it's not worth it to try to emulate a solver is because you can't. I just think you can't. Like it's just something you won't be able to do. And so given these constraints that like you can't play like a solver, you won't be able to emulate that. So then what are our options? Our options are to do the next best thing and gain the EV in the next best way that we can. I mean, naturally a perfect solver that's like solving in real time exploitatively makes the most, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's making maximal exploitative calculations makes the most. I think a GTO solver would still outperform any human being exploiting a pool. And then I think, and then there's a person trying to map theory as best they can onto the world that they see. And then below that is someone trying to emulate a solver. Like that's like the
Mm-hmm.
hierarchy I see of potential win rates. But let me just frame my background on this a little too, because I was one of the first investors in this Ruse project. I don't know if you're familiar with Ruse AI.
No. Mm-mm.
Okay, so Ruse AI is this AI driven poker engine. It solves in real time. It's a really sweet, AI poker bot.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I've seen data against it playing against like other poker bots, other AI poker bots, and in getting into this as being a partner on it, I've just gained much I've just seen much more data on how poker bots perform against humans. And
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty startling. Like so Slumbot is a open source poker bot. You can it plays heads up. You could go play it right now
Mm-hmm.
and it will crush any human, like
Mm-hmm.
destroy any human in heads up poker. And Ruse beat it for like 19 big blinds per 100. So like the gap even between poker bots, like GTO poker bots, is pretty massive. Like how good a solver can, like it is very difficult to get a Pio level solver to actually be capable of playing because it requires the solve time is so long and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Ruse, I think, is probably the closest thing we have today that can actually do close to Pio level solutions in real time. And yeah, like I said, it annihilated the next best bot. Not technically, there's one other, but it's not open source, so we can't play against it. But one of
Mm-hmm.
the best bots called Slumbot for like 19 big blinds per 100. And if you got anyone to sit down against Slumbot, it would destroy them. Like from the
Yep.
best players to the worst players, it would just annihilate them. So again, I just put all this to you.
Sure. Okay, I have a few questions just before I respond. So first off, is Slumber a GTO algorithm seeking bot like Pile Solver?
So
Or is
it
it like
is
is it machine learning kind of adaptive?
a bit of both. So like it is sort
Okay.
of it's more of a lookup, like it's more looking up it's more of like a solution lookup, like it's closer to a database like that it's like looking up and acting on. But it does a sort of like abstraction based on, because you can, when you play against it, you have like a free bet sizing. No, you can do like
Mm-hmm.
quarter or half pot. It's not free. Sorry. You do have some limited options, I think,
Mm-hmm.
but it does some like abstractions based on your bet sizes to presume your strategy, right? And then
Okay.
it does some hand chunking for strategy calculation. So it doesn't treat
Mm-hmm.
all hands as unique.
Okay.
These are like the limitations of it. So actually, on Run It Once, Kevin Rabichow, who is another one of the partners on this project with me, has done like a 5-part series on this match between Ruse and Slumbot. It's actually pretty fascinating because we have the hand
Mm-hmm.
history, which I can share with you if you're curious.
Wow. Yeah, I'm
But
really curious. This is
we
awesome.
have like we have like I have like 370,000 hand history between the two of them. And so
Mm-hmm.
you can just like go through and like look at how you can look at the stats that they're playing in different spots. It's fascinating.
Okay.
But yeah, Kevin Rabichow did like a 5-part series breaking down these two strategies.
Okay.
But yeah, so
So
that is how Slumbot works roughly.
okay, so can Slumbot observe my strategy when I play against it and make exploitative deviations to
No,
any extent?
no,
No. Okay. So it is a true sort of GTO
yeah, yeah,
solver. It's just looking up spots to try and approximate, right? Okay.
yep,
So I'm not at all surprised that heads up, a solver has a massive win rate against any human. Like I think that's definitely the case. I think if you put a solver into a game with 5 regs as well, it would have a pretty big win rate. But the rake is also a very big win rate, right? I think like 8 BBs and stuff like that is quite a large
yeah,
amount per 100 hands for 6 max, considering that it's not like heads up where you're playing every spot. In 100 hands, you're actually folding 75 of them before the flop on average, right?
sure.
So only
You're also
25
not
of
paying
those
rake in those
100
hands
hands,
though. You're not.
you're not
So
paying rake in those hands, that's true. But only 25 of those 100 hands are being played. So my main argument isn't actually that a solver wouldn't beat 25 and L. My argument is that it's not clear to me that it would. I don't have any data to say that it would. Like you seem to have. Well, you have data for heads up, right? That
yeah,
solvers can have massive win rates against other solvers. Now, that could be what that seems to imply is that getting close to like an objectively optimal strategy does lead to like a very big BB per 100 gain, right?
yeah,
And if that's true, then I will reconsider
yeah.
my position for sure. But where my position really comes from is the following sort of argument, right? So let's see if you can accept another one of my good old premises here. I'll put one out there. We'll see if we can agree on it, and then we can go from there, right? Because if
Okay.
we don't, there's not much point in me like rambling
Sure,
on.
sure, sure.
So the first thing I'm gonna say is that if I was in a game with 5, let's not even say me, let's just say that like a decent student of ours, like that plays 100 NL and is a small winner, let's say, right, decent
Okay.
poker player like that,
Yeah.
is in a game, a live game, shall we say,
Okay.
with okay, no, let's not even take a live game. Let's just say a 25 NL field that has 5 recreationals at the table. It's a regular table, and they're running a HUD, and they can see who the old man coffee is that's folding all the time. They can see who the whale is that's blasting off with any 2 cards. I would put to you that that player would have a much bigger win rate at that table than a GTO solver would.
Yeah. I don't agree with that at all.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, and the big thing, so one of the things that has been startling for me in getting into, I think 3 years ago I would have agreed with you.
Okay.
But in getting into more of these, like just learning more about these bots. And what's funny today, this morning, one of the creators of the company that I'm a partner on saw your video and was
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, no shot. Like our bot would crush. And so we're working on getting multi-way with Ruse. So we'll actually be able to
Mm-hmm.
like have some more data on this. But like to think basically like so I think that player, the player you just described, would have a
Mm-hmm.
much harder time overcoming the rake than a solver would. And I think to put a solver in that, you should look at it like if we just let's talk heads up, because I think this is like an easy way to talk about this. If we just put 2 players against each other heads up, let's say there's just 2 unknowns, you don't know who they are.
Mm.
How would you, without, let's say we have 2 million hands histories of these two who've played against each other, but we don't have the results. We don't have who won more. How would you go about determining the winner? Like you have all the hands, but you for example, you can't see the final data point of the amount of money they made. So you have their databases, let's say. You just have their
Okay.
databases. How
Okay.
would you go about it? And B, you can not not a practical strategy, but just like how
Mhm.
like how would you program a computer to determine who won? You know what I mean? Or like to get an idea of who's the better player.
Okay, so if I'm not allowed to look at the results of individual pots and just weigh those up mechanically, and I need
Yeah.
to like
And
strategically
just like
engage, I think
total
you're
them.
trying
Yeah,
to get
you
me,
can't
you're
total
trying
like
to, you're getting me to like strategically engage with this question, right? Instead
yeah.
of just adding things up. So what I would really do is there'd be two things I would look at. One would just be the number of like objective mistakes they make from like where there would be theoretical EV losses. That would definitely be something I would look at. So I
Okay.
would say, okay, this player has made a polarization error on this turn. This player has used like a combo in an unfavorable world that's hopeless and has therefore lost like a lot of EV by trying to bluff with it. These are the ways
Yep.
that humans will blunder EV against solvers, right? They'll make bluffs that shouldn't work. They'll make check raises with a hand that has no business check raising. They'll take a line that's far worse than another line.
Yeah.
And there are lots of spots where there is a big EV difference between one line and another in theory.
Yep.
And I would look at those first. Another thing I would do that I think is really important as well is I would look at the exploitative matchup between these two strategies. For example,
Yep.
if you have a player that's folding all of the time pre-flop, is like really tight, never calling three bets, they're going to lose a lot more to a player that's abusing the hell out of them and three betting 40% than they will
Yep.
lose pre-flop to a bot that's only three betting 20%. So I think you also have to look at the mismatch or match between the
Exactly.
two exploitative strategies. Now, the crux of my questioning, I
Yeah.
don't want to say a claim that like it's funny because the video was actually called Would a Solver Beat 25NL? It's not actually called A Solver Wouldn't Beat 25NL, but I think I've somehow been forced and polarized through social media into the camp that I've said that it wouldn't. I actually conclude the video by saying I think there's some good evidence that it might not, right? Which is not the same thing as saying I know it wouldn't. I
Sure. Yeah. Of
absolutely
course.
don't know that it
Of
wouldn't.
course. Yeah.
Um, but the reason, one of the main reasons I came to that conclusion is that there are a lot of spots, and particularly spots in big pots, where at 25NL, your opponent is playing a really bad strategy and you're aware of what it is. So if you're a
Yeah.
good reg, you're aware that the population is playing in a really bad way. And if you are even just an average reg, you might be against a fish that's too tight or a fish that's a maniac and you just know what to do. Now, a lot of those regs in that game are going to still get it wrong and like fold against the maniac because they're uncomfortable and there's still a
Sure.
large margin for error there. And perhaps I am focusing too heavily on the spots where the solver doesn't have as good a read as the human, because I definitely think there are individual spots where a
Yeah.
human does have a much bigger win rate than a solver, like
Easy. Yeah.
undeniably, right? Because the
Easy. Yeah.
solver's like playing not exploiting or
Yeah.
is forcing
Obviously true.
itself to play in a
Obviously
balanced
must be
way.
true.
Obviously
Yeah.
true,
Yeah.
right? Now the question is, are those spots, is the win rate that you actually see gleaned from that exploit, is that big enough and is it recurring enough to make a difference when the human like undisputably sacrifices way more EV than the solver does just across like theoretically
Yeah.
run of the mill? I will say that that's diluted somewhat by the noise of exploitative play, whereby sometimes your opponent is playing in a way that makes a GTO play really bad and another play really good. And this happens totally accidentally. Like you have two opponents that are just playing completely way
Yep.
outside of GTO and one strategy just accidentally kills the
Yep.
other. You would agree
Yep.
that that's possible as well.
Yep.
And that not only creates situations where the human can do better than a solver against another human, but it also creates situations where there's just distortion and the theoretical EV is washed away a little bit, not fully, but it's
Yeah.
dumbed down by the distortion of this exploitative kind of static, if you will.
Yeah.
Now, all of these things give me rise to question this and to ask this question, because there are so many spots where I'll say to a student, the solver approved play here is horrible against your opponent, against this
Sure.
pool in this spot. There are many plays like that. And there are other plays where it's the best play as well. But I think what I've begun to realize recently is that there are a ton of spots where, because the humans are so exploitable, so exploitable, that the GTO strategy is very far from the best way to exploit them. I think there's a massive difference here between heads up against the bot, even two bots against each other heads up. Although it does surprise me that there was such a big win rate from one bot
Yeah.
over the other, but I'd need to see the details to understand that fully.
Yeah.
But going back to the heads up environment, that's such a different ball game because it's a zero sum game. You just have you and the opponent, and if the opponent's better than you at making theoretical choices, they will beat you, especially if there's no exploitative openings for you to claw back any of the money. That's obvious to
Yeah.
me that I would lose heavily against any of these bots you're talking about, against Ruse, against the other one. I would lose heavily, no doubt. I'm not sure it follows from that at a soft game like 25NL, a bot would have a bigger win rate than like a really strong human. Would it be? There are really strong humans that beat rate considerably. There are
Yeah.
other ones that are quite strong in high rate games that just win. There's quite a cap on what they can win, I think,
Yeah,
these days
yeah,
with these
yeah.
rate structures. So it's not the case that I think a bot would or wouldn't beat this game. I just think that the GTO solution is much less powerful than the human against the weaker player. I
Yeah,
think the human skill edge can be much bigger than the machine versus human skill edge in many spots. And I think that at least draws into question the idea of what would the bot's win rate be post rate, given that it gives up the CV that the human takes in lots of spots. I have another thing I want to ask you about. You probably know more about than me actually, which is GTO Wizard BB per 100 to GTO comparisons. You probably like looked at that a little bit, where players are like over 100,000 hands. It says I lost 2 BB per 100 compared to the GTO solution.
sure,
And I've worked with players that are losing at 10 and L that have a loss rate of 2 or 3 BB per 100 compared to
sure.
the GTO solution, which makes me wonder, like,
Yep.
well,
Okay.
how is that possible?
I mean,
So
this
you might
is
have an explanation for that.
yeah, this is a fairly trivial explanation in my opinion,
Okay.
which is just goes to why I think GTO Wizards is such a bad tool. But it's when you create a when you create a like a so exploitability, like for like BBs per 100 as a metric, is just widely misunderstood, I think, in the poker community as a whole when you're using it from solver output metrics, because it's specifically against one the solution of the that you're playing against, right? So GTO Wizard solution against itself. And then it's also based on, so like GTO Wizard has like 6 sizes, you know what I mean, and like lots of spots. So if I run my hands through it, it's not taking in any sort of like strategic implications of my strategy as a whole in this spot. It's just comparing, yeah, that size to the particular response in that moment, but also it's also presuming that you played every moment after that hand correctly based on that decision, right? So like you can be driving yourself to parts of the game tree and then punting off money later, but like at the moment of decision, it could be like that's fine. But it's comparing, like if I put in like 6 sizes and like each size is being taken at like 1% frequency, and I now take that action, it's like, oh, you made no mistakes. You know what I mean? And like, it's like, oh, you played at zero EV loss. But it's also like, it's also just a matter of how like exploit the GTO wizard solutions aren't ran to like a super low exploitability. So like they're also like I would, you could, and this is the shocking thing about getting poker bots to play against each other, to think that like a like Pio wouldn't have a huge edge against GTO wizard is probably not true. Like a pure GTO bot against GTO wizard would probably annihilate GTO. It's internal calculations. You know what I mean? It's based on like, it's a toy game. It's like based on this environment. If you played in this environment perfectly, this would be your EV loss. So like I'm not using that as like a metric, as like I don't use EV loss as a metric of how good or bad your decision was. But like some considerations that I think can be brought up based on the things you're thinking about in terms of would a solver beat 25 and now. One, I do think you're placing too much emphasis on these large spots where big exploits are possible, and not enough on all these on every single spot. And how much what really moves in spots is often the fringes of strategies, not the strategy as a whole. And there's spots where square in the center, that is like what is a good call in a spot, is not really being moved by people's strategies anyway. And it's a good call that every human player is missing. Like there's just so many spots that are like square in the center of your strategy where like, yeah, maybe on the fringes things should move, but like tons of just like, yeah, dead center strategies people are just missing. The second thing is the Ruse 19 big blind per 100 win rate against Slumbot was done with a what we call dynamic sizing. So Ruse simplifies for a single bet size strategy in every spot, and it's only using one size, against Slumbot, which is capable of using multiple sizes and treating you like you're using multiple sizes. And we annihilated it with this. And my point in bringing this up is people, I think, seriously undervalue the effect of knowing the correct bet size and the correct strategy corresponding to that bet size in every single situation, like the highest EV strategy. And that is something human beings are not good at. And that is something 25NL players are particularly terrible at. and that is that results in a pretty large win rate differential, just that alone. And it's evidenced by the fact that we were using single sizes against Slumbot, and Slumbot has a far more complex library of strategies available to it, and it's balancing these. And this is something Kevin gets into. But just being able to pick and execute on a single size better results in a huge EV gain. And so like spots where you're overbetting and people just don't know how to respond to an overbet. And yeah, granted, you could be value betting thinner, but like no human being is going to do that appropriately anyway in spots, right? And that's the thing is like, but GTO Wizard, I mean, sorry, not GTO Wizard, Ruse will value bet the thin enough, and probably thinner than most people are willing to in spots where it's printing money, to like value bet thinly. It will also bluff catch in spots where people are just blasting off, and where people are not willing to. And like sure, there will be spots where like there will be some big spots where Ruse is just lighting money on fire, like no denying that. But I would be startled, not just I would be shocked to see that not just that Ruse AI is beating 25 NL and fortunately again, this is coming, so we're not going to have to like hold our breath on this, but not just that it'll beat it, but that it will just crush people. Like I think it would just annihilate any human player who had ever played 25 NL. Would be my suspicion.
Okay,
But
yeah, that's all really interesting, and I'm
yeah,
glad I asked this question because it has provoked like a lot of response from both sides. This is the first time I've been given an actual argument or the claim that there's data that this would be the case. Now, I will say that I think there's a very large difference between being heads up against one opponent,
yeah,
right? And then there's a very large difference between being in a rock, paper, scissors, triangulating kind of situation and not being, because when we're heads up, there's no third party that I can exploit better than you. Like if me,
yeah,
you,
sure,
and my dog Smudge, who's right down here, are playing in like a three-way Texas Hold'em game, and Smudge is like a horrendous whale, and I'm a human and you're a solver, and I know exactly how Smudge plays because he's my dog, right? There's no denying that like I can have a bigger win rate over Smudge than you can in that game.
yeah.
Probably.
I
But
actually don't
against
think so.
you will crush.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't.
So yeah, I actually think so. Like
Right.
let's say you were playing two heads up matches,
Mm,
and one of them is against the solver. We're in a blitz heads up pool, right? Let's just say that. Like we're in a blitz heads
mm,
up pool, and there's a
right.
whale, and there's you, and there's a Ruse.
Yeah.
Ruse beats you. if you're
Yeah.
cross booked against Ruse, Ruse annihilates you. Like
Mm-hmm.
you won't even come close. Even with the whale, one Ruse will crush you for like 19 big blinds per
Yeah, of
100.
course. Of
But
course.
but
So
two,
leaving that aside,
it will
so
still be
leaving
it'll beat the whale more than you, I think.
it'll beat the whale more than I will, and
At
that's
least as
because
much. At least as much, but like
right, right.
probably more.
And that's because you think that I'm just making loads of mistakes just generally that are just lower
Tiny
EV
mistakes.
objectively, tiny mistakes that are just
Yeah.
adding up.
Yeah.
And that equates to way more than like the sort of stark things that are staring us in the face when we're doing a coaching session. I'm saying, wow, you lost
Yeah.
like loads of EV by copying the solver in that one spot. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I feel like I'm pretty outgunned here, given your background. I feel like I don't at all have the data to come back at you with anything. And I really want to play devil's advocate here. But all I can really say
Yeah.
right
That's
now
fair.
is that I'm really stoked to hear like what happens when you trial this out six max. I'd love to
Yeah.
hear how it does in an environment where it doesn't get to play every hand, where it has to fold
Yeah.
loads
It'll play
pre-flop. It's
multi-way
going to
too.
dumb it.
That's
Sure, it's going
yeah.
to dilute its edge though. The fact that it can't be in all the pots. Like heads up back in the day, I always had a much
Yeah.
bigger win rate. Heads up than multi-way, I think that's really normal. So this 16 BB per 100 that it beats another bot pie, that's
19.
incredible.
19.
19, sorry, so not to downplay
19.
the ability of
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
solver
Yeah.
here. So yeah, this 12 BB per 100 did it beat the other bot by? Just kidding.
Yeah.
19.
Yeah.
It's very impressive and it's very big. And I'm taking it that was over a really big sample as well. Yeah.
I mean, fairly big. So our standard deviation is, I think, 3.5 big blinds per 100. So it was 170K hands heads up.
Right. Okay. That's decent. So it's
Yeah.
somewhere like, and what confidence interval is that? Is that like 95
Yeah.
or
Like
do you
it's like a
think it's
double,
within?
like a two standard deviation
Okay.
confidence interval. Yeah. So like,
Okay. So you're
yeah,
98% within 3.5 either
five.
way of
Yeah. So
that over
up or
that
down.
sample.
Don't,
Okay.
it's somewhere around that number. I'm not like, I'm not reciting it,
Yeah.
but it's close to that. Yeah.
So this is amazing to hear. It's amazing because it kind of opens the door to a ceiling level of performance that I wasn't sure was actually obtainable. Like if a
Yeah.
bot can crush another bot like
Yeah.
that, like if you asked me what do I think the EV difference between one bot and another bot would be when they're both like drawing from GTO libraries of varying
Yeah.
abilities, unless one of the bots is just really flawed in some way. And
Yeah.
unless they have adaptive, and just to clarify, they have absolutely no adaptive ability here whatsoever, right? They can't
Yeah.
observe the other
No. Yeah. Not at
strategy and
all.
do anything
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm shocked that it's that big.
I
I'm
know.
absolutely shocked. And that
Yeah.
alone, if that's true, is probably enough to make me just say I'm probably like the answer is probably that a bot would beat 25NL
Yeah.
quite considerably if
Yeah.
that's true. I don't think it would beat it. I don't think a bot at 6 max would have anything like a 19 BB per 100 against 5 other bots of that same skill discrepancy, because like the
Yeah.
dilution of the 6 max game is just going to, water that
Sure.
down considerably.
Yeah.
By a factor of 5 or 6, it's going to be lower. But it would still mean that a bot against another bot could have like a 4 or 5 BB per 100 win rate, or a 3
Yeah.
or 4
Yeah.
BB per 100 win rate, which is still like really impressive and way more than I thought would happen.
Well,
Then if
the
you
the tough
compare,
thing is that like once we have a multi-way bot, the only other
mm,
one that's close is this program called Prometheus, which in my opinion is pretty terrible. But
mhm,
yeah, like if you yeah, I mean the tough thing about comparing that is it'll just take forever before we have two
mm,
different bots approaching like doing the same thing but approached in different ways where we can actually compare them. But it's kind of like chess engines, right? Like you look at chess
mm,
engines and you're like, oh, okay, this engine is like perfect. And then another one comes by and like never loses to it.
yeah,
And like a
yeah,
lot of people, it's like that's just crazy. But like, yeah, it's just like once you're performing at like a superhuman level, it's I think the cap on just like these types of performance is much higher than humanly intuitable. Like
mhm,
we intuit that it's just like, oh, surely these are all very close because it's playing more perfect than I could. But
mhm,
the other thing, sorry, I just wanted to because one of the things you said was that if you were playing against it, it's not just all the small errors, to be clear. It's
mhm,
also the large strategic decision making that the bot will be making, which will return a lot in EV. So even though, like, let's say I put you guys both in a spot and you're executing your strategy as if we like, put that size into a solver perfectly,
mhm.
there's a big edge in just the solver picking a better strategy. Like
Right,
it's like you're
mhm,
going to overbet 150%. It's going to overbet to 250%
right,
totally
mhm.
happily. And the EV difference between those two will not be negligible, is what we've
Okay,
just found by these two, things being done. So that's
that's interesting.
yeah. So those two things combined, I think would result in something like Ruse just annihilating six max.
Mhm.
But
And this is something we don't see in Pio, because very often we just put in one sizing,
yeah,
and maybe every now and then someone will co-run that against a different strategy and say, oh look, that one performs slightly better or whatever,
yeah,
but there's not a massive difference. What I have found though is when you do start plugging in like really big sizes on the turn and then removing them, that
yeah,
appears to be where the biggest EV loss is. So if I say to
yeah,
you, you can have B33 or B75 or B150, that strategy will have a very similar EV to just B150,
yeah,
right? So if I get rid of the smaller sizes,
yeah,
I've seen the EV loss there isn't as big. I don't know if you found this as well,
yeah,
but when you remove the overbet, it starts to dip a lot more starkly. So I can see like these unconventionally big and maybe in some cases unconventionally small sizes needing to be there. And that's a
yeah.
really interesting point I didn't actually consider.
Yeah, and I actually have an interesting spreadsheet I can show you where
Mm,
before this I was running a script that would make Pio run like a turn with one size, then run it with another size, just one size, not all three, and then comparing, but just run with each one size, and then save that data, and then basically save the solution with the highest DB size. And even in that experiment, I found once you're simplifying to one size, any single size, like the correct choice and the not correct choice was a pretty wide differential in EV.
mm-hmm,
And like,
mm-hmm.
and it's in some spots less than others, but in some spots it's huge. Um,
Yeah. So maybe I can ask you a couple of quick things then on that note, because I've now become really curious
yeah,
about what this means. So
yeah,
if we're going to say that a solver, like the one you're building, goes into a six max game and can have an absolutely colossal win rate against like even really strong humans. So it's winning 3 or 4 BBs against another solver because it
yeah,
was winning 19 in heads up, right? That's just a rough
yeah.
estimate for
I think
now,
it'll even be more than that, but yeah, go ahead.
right?
Yeah, so
Okay,
yeah,
so say it's winning 6 or 7, and then
yeah,
against the human, it's winning double or triple that, and it's
yeah,
beating like good humans for 20 BB per
yeah. It's
100
just
and things
annihilating
like that.
people. Yeah,
Um, I mean, first off, what that would mean if it's beating humans by 20 BB per 100, if it's only playing a fifth of the hands it's actually dealt, right, or a quarter of the hands it's actually dealt,
Okay, yeah, yeah.
then in a spot where it plays a hand, it beats people for like 80 BB per 100 or zero point 0.8 big blinds every hand it plays. That seems like a hell of a lot, but
Yeah,
maybe
so
it's right when the pot gets big, but it seems
so
like a lot,
six so
right?
in six max, I wouldn't be surprised if the difference between bot v bot play and human v bot play were not as wide
Right.
than as heads up. So like let's
Mm-hmm.
say it beats bot v bot. Like it's tough to say what it would be bot v bot because like I said, we don't have a second best bot that can play
Mm-hmm.
multi-way right now. So it's a really hard thing to say like what would it beat another bot for because we don't have
Mm.
a specific bot. I know Slumbot is X good. So like we know we're beating Slumbot for 20 BBs. But so it's really hard to say because once you get a bot good enough that can play in real time multi way, it probably is approaching it in a very similar way to the way Ruse is doing it, which means they're probably pretty negligible in win rate, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I would not be surprised at all that if once Ruse gets multi way capabilities, that it is beating humans for like a pretty significant win rate. Let's say it's beating humans like 9 BB per 100.
Okay, sure.
That wouldn't shock me at all.
That sounds more reasonable. Yep.
Yeah, like
Mm-hmm.
good humans, like good,
Mm-hmm.
well, good humans, like for like 9 BB. That wouldn't surprise me at all. And like I said, we don't really know up to this point, but all the data I have seen about the performance of these bots in play, and the more that I've been, yeah, sort of like wrapping my because when I first saw the Slumbot match, it was mind blowing, just like you said, like it was like this is insane. Because Slumbot was the winner at like some competition, some poker AI competition. It won, and it's got tons of hands histories against humans, and like it annihilates people. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and then Ruse beats it for like 19 BBs per 100. Like I said, I can
Yeah.
get you all the hand histories and stuff, so you can check them out yourself. But yeah, it's just wild. But yeah, it would. I definitely think it would beat good humans for pretty sizable amounts.
Okay. So I think you've convinced me that a solver that's that good or that solver would beat 25 and L.
Yeah.
Um, I think I can't really argue with like the raw data that you have. It seems like too much of an uphill battle to even try and construct an argument like based on. But I think the line of questioning is interesting. That like
Yeah.
a solver. It's good to open people's eyes to the fact that it's very often better in individual spots to not do what the solver's doing.
Yeah.
But then
Yeah.
in like loads of spots, your understanding will be wrong, and what the solver's doing is better than yours, like unbeknownst to you, or there's some strategy that isn't even on your radar that you could be playing. I think the other side of this is really important from a coaching standpoint as well. That, well, maybe you think that by using B75 as your only turn size, that there's not any EV loss, but data is actually beginning to suggest now that there could be a large EV loss by
Yeah.
not using B200 in that turn spot with the big asymmetry or whatever it is. Other question: what does this do to the state of online poker, in your opinion? I mean, online poker is already in a pretty precarious place. What do you think is going to happen when products like Ruse hit the market and people are able to actually, I don't know,
So
will there be a way of stopping them just using this at the poker table?
yeah, I mean, so Ruse has a public beta you can access right now. So yeah, so Ruse is already fairly open to the market. It's a beta version. It's still, it's pay per use still, but like you can get on and you can look at solutions. You can instantly change bet sizes and see the EV like in 2 seconds. It'll just update. Um, yeah, so I mean, you can use it right now. I think what's important, and as a member of the Ruse team, what's important to all of us is that we just find a way to, while also prioritizing our ability to help people study, also prioritizing game security. And
Mm-hmm.
so like we want to work with online operators, and we want to work on that side of it as much as we're working on the study and creation side. So I think as long as it does become like an arms race, right? Like you do have to kind of be ahead of people, but I think as long as there's good collaboration between the people making these tools and the poker sites themselves, um, it should be fine. I think poker will stay alive and well. And
Yeah.
if anything, it might become actually easier to detect cheating with better
Mm-hmm.
tools. Like we might be able to predict, with AI, you might be able to have some sort of human intuition score on a certain play. Like you might be able to be like, oh, this is humans on average play this spot in this way. And you deviated it. Now, technically it's correct, but you deviated in some massive way that is horribly unlikely. And now we just start watching you a little
Mm-hmm.
closer. Like as tools get better, it's just like, I think detection will get better as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important that sites are aware of this and are actually on board with this. I think there are poker sites out there that are.
Yeah.
There are probably others that just look the other way. And I think they need to be, boycotted, and things need to be done to sort of really help the sites that are trying to
Yeah,
fight
absolutely.
this fight. Because in a few years, as these tools get better, and it's not just people frantically clicking GTO Wizard on their other monitor and thinking it's going to do anything for them.
Yeah.
Like when tools get really good and they can actually put themselves, like an Android version of themselves, into the game,
Yeah.
we're going to need to like do something about that, or online
Yep.
poker is really going to die. But maybe that's a question for another day. But yeah, that's fascinating. I'd love to see more about
Yeah.
ruse and the way it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah, man. I'll send you all the data. I can put you in contact with the guys too, and they can make a far better case than I probably can on why, because they were also quite convinced, like, there's no way, like, ruse would
Mm.
destroy. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
well, Pete, this has been an amazing conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Same here.
Yeah.
It's been great.
Yeah, it's been great. So, thank you so much for coming on, and until next time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Talk to you soon, Jared.
All right.